Good afternoon, guys. How are you doing?
Good afternoon. I'm doing well. How are you, Miss Ya?
I'm all right. Thanks for asking. How are you, Shari?
I'm doing just fine. Nice to hear all of you.
The feeling is mutual. But I'm glad that we could get together this afternoon to talk about all things poetry on this podcast. And this afternoon, we have some very interesting poems to discuss. And I'm looking forward to hearing all the wonderful thoughts that you guys have to share on our poems. The themes are quite interesting: love, death, historical issues, social issues, and women poets. And there's a wealth of information on those themes. So since, as usual, we're here to share and discuss and edify each other with what we have researched, I look forward to a pleasant afternoon with you. So I think the first theme that we're going to get into is that of love. And Shari, I believe that you can give us some good insight into that particular theme. So without further ado, it would be nice if you could do that for us.
Definitely. And so we'll get into the theme of love. Love is a wonderful form of literary expression. And so the following poems, Little Boy Crying by Marvin Morris and My Parents by Stephen Spender, deals with this interesting theme. But before that, let me give an insight on each poet. Marvin Morris was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and studied at the University College of the West Indies at Stanford Hall, Oxford. In 1970, he began lecturing at the University of West Indies. He is credited with spreading importance of Jamaican culture with his poem. He is considered one of the most prominent West Indian poets of his generation. Stephen Spender. Stephen Spender was born in 1909 in London, and he was a part of the British poets era. In the 1930s, he wrote with a social and political consciousness, reflecting on events such as the Great Depression, World War II, are just some of his reflective pieces. Little Boy Crying by Marvis Morris. The poem begins with a child crying. His cries are of pain and anger, since he does not understand why his father had slapped him. The father, on the other hand, sees himself as a parent who is teaching his son a lesson for playing in the rain. However, guilt overtakes him as he longs to comfort his son, but does not do so because he does not want to ruin the lesson that his son should learn. Further into this poem, we have some interesting literary devices. And these devices helps to bring out the theme of love. We have the literary device of allusion, and we have literary device of contrast and imagery. But I'm going to focus on contrast, which is used to show which is used to show how the little boy is feeling. At the beginning, we can see that he's filled with love and he's happy. And then There's a shift in the poem where he's not that happy after he would have received a punishment and he's looking forward for that love and comfort from his father. We also have the literary device of imagery. The father wants us to picture the good times that he would have had with his son, the times that he would lift him up and play with him, expressing his gentle and loving nature. In my next poem, My Parents by Stephen Spender, the situation is that the persona reflects on his unhappy childhood as he described his bullies and the feeling of being bullied. His parents kept him sheltered, safe, or protected from children of the community who sees him as weak or different. The persona longed to forgive them, but they never give him an opportunity to do so. Let's delve further into this poem as we look at the literary devices to bring out the theme of love. Imagery is used to describe how his parents would have protected him, sheltered him, and even clasped him in their arms when he was a child. We can clearly see that love and affection is highlighted here. Metaphor is also another literary device that is used to compare his parents' protective love. It is seen as a shield that they use to protect him from harm. And here you have completed insight on both poets.
Thank you,
My
Shari. We really appreciated how you expounded on that. Gave us some good insight into those poems. The first one by Marvin Morris is a new poem to me, so I was very happy that I managed to hear your thoughts on that poem.
I agree with you, sir. Thank you for your insight there, Miss Shari.
You're
Great.
welcome.
So I think that Raissa is up next, and she will be sharing with us some insightful poems written by women poets. So, Raissa, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you guys. Today I'll be covering the theme Women Poets, and the poems I've selected are Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou and Death Came to See Me in Hot Pink Pants by Heather Royce. Now, let me give you a little brief discussion of each poet. Maya Angelou was an American poet, author, and civil rights advocate who was born in 1928. The message of her poem, Phenomenal Woman, is praised for being inspirational. Her writing encourages and celebrates the strength of women and their personal experiences. Maya Angelou was an advocate for equality as well as a well-known autobiographer. Heather Royce is a Jamaican-born poet known for her thought-provoking and imaginative work. Her poetry explores themes of morality, identity, and human experiences. Through vivid visuals and original approaches to topics like morality, Royce has a special talent for challenging traditional viewpoints. Her poem, Death Came to See Me in Hot Pink Pants, is an illustration of her capacity to add playfulness to her writing while still communicating more profound ideas. Now, in Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou, it depicts a situation where the speaker confidently celebrates her own beauty, her own unique beauty. This poem emphasizes that true allure is not based on conventional standards, but from self-assurance and charisma. She encourages her readers to embrace their individuality, love themselves, and to recognize their extraordinary qualities. This poem serves as a powerful call to self-acceptance, self-celebration, and empowerment. Now, in Death Came to See Me in Hot Pink Pants by Heather Royce, the poem basically describes a dream in which the speaker encounters death. The death appears in an unexpected form, wearing hot pink pants and a matching waistcoat. The dream alters a typical portrayal of death as being gloomy or sad by showing it as a handsome, mythical youth. Death then laughs as the speaker hits him with a staff, and he continues to rise up. The speaker then wakes up from the dream feeling out of breath. This poem examines the complicated relationship between life and morality and questions conventional beliefs about death. Now, the theme of women poets, I would say both poems embody the power of women's voices and their ability to address significant themes with creativity and insight. They contribute to the rich tradition of women's poetry and serve as a reminder of the valuable perspectives and contributions that women poets bring to the literary world. Now, some devices that I notice in them are, firstly, in Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou, the effective use of repetition reinforces the empowering message that she's trying to bring across. The rhythmic structure adds a musical quality, engaging the reader and enhancing the poem's celebratory tone. Now, in Death Came to See Me in Hot Pink Pants by Heather Royce, she uses a lot of vivid imagery to create a memorable portrayal of death, challenging the conventional views that we have of death. Additionally, irony adds complexity to the unconventional appearance of death, with the speaker's initial fear and subsequent awe. These devices contribute to the poem's effectiveness by engaging readers emotionally and intellectually, capturing their attention and prompting contemplation of the themes of empowerment, mortality, and societal expectations. Both poems encourage individuality, self-acceptance, and the celebration of one's unique qualities. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Raissa. I was just recently exposed to Death Came to See Me in a Hot Pink Pants, and it's already one of my favorite poems.
Mine too.
Yes, so our discussion is going quite well. I believe Esther would be taking us into the next round of poems. She'll be dealing with social issues. We're living in a time of many social issues. Esther, let's see what you have to share with us.
That is so true what you said. A time where social issues are so prevalent. But I must comment on Raissa Young. I loved how she used Maya Angelou. Sorry. She is my all-time favorite woman poet. So let me get into my piece of discussion here. And as Sarah said, I'm dealing with social issues. And the first that I'm going to look at is a poem by Langston Hughes. It's called Theme for English B. Now, let me just give you a brief biography of Mr. Langston Hughes. Now, this poem that is written here, was published in 1951. And Langston Hughes is an American poet, and during coming down to the ending of his career, he wrote this poem. Now, Mr. Langston Hughes, he was sorry. He was born on the February 1st, 1902 in New York and died on May 22nd, 1996. He was an American writer who was an important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Now, the Harlem Renaissance was an African American cultural movement that flourished in the 1920s in Harlem and the New York City. Harlem, New York City, sorry, where where the creativity of Africans in music and theaters began, and visual arts was most associated with literature. Now, this poem here is written in the voice of a 22-year-old Black man, a college student, whose professor tasked the entire class to write a one-page essay about themselves. Now, with this poem here, the voice of the Black man, he's asking himself if it's that simple, because in his class, he was the only Black person. He was the only college student. And he's wondering, would it be this simple to me to sit and write about myself? And he asked himself the question, who am I? Right? And whilst writing the poem, or whilst talking or thinking, he's puzzling through difficult issues about race, identity, belonging. And on this poem, I'll mostly be focusing on racism, because the person here is a Black man in a all-white class. And to bring out the theme of racism in this poem, Langston Hughes used imagery. Just a minute, sorry. Yes, imagery. He also used rhetorical questions, like the question, I wonder if it's that simple, to point to us or to let us emphasize on the context that it's not that simple to write about yourself when you're a Black man, especially in those times, right? And then he also used euphemism, where he said, sometimes perhaps you don't want to be a part of me. This is bringing out the possibility of the professor being racist. But then at the end of that poem, he said, at the end of the poem, he says, whether you want to be like me, or he concludes that white and Black people are not and should not be separate or distinct. Instead, they should be a part, or they are a part of each other. And this is how he brings out the theme of racism in this poem. In my next poem, I will be looking at the poem, The Woman Speaks to the Man Who Has Employed Her Son. And this is by Lerna Goodison. Now, Lerna Goodison she's a Caribbean poet. She's Jamaican, and she was born on the 1st of August, 1947. That's when we celebrate Emancipation Day. And she was a painter before she became an author, before she turned to or focused on poetry. And she was appointed Poet Laureate of Jamaica in 2017. And she received many, many awards in 2018, 2019, and 2017 that established her as one of the greatest poets. In this poem, this poem is about a woman that is talking to a man that has employed her son. Now, she's angry at this man because we know that when somebody employs someone, it should be a good thing. However, this is not really a good thing, because what this man employed her son into was into a life of destruction and damnation. And to bring out the theme of social issue, of it being a social issue, she uses irony in the sentence where she said, in the line where she said, sorry, But now he tells me he's working for you, that you value him so much. You gave him one whole submachine gun for him alone. Now, this is very ironic because if someone values you, they would not give you a gun. A gun would not be the first thing that they would give to you. And that's very ironic because the son now feels that because he was given this, he's held at a high self-esteem. But when the gun is just a terrible weapon of destruction that will cause destruction to him, and not only to him, but to his community also. And another device that was used was biblical illusion. And this is where she quotes, where she says, he says you are like a father to him. And she's wondering what kind of father would give a son hot and exploding dead when he asked him for bread. And this is to reference the book of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 9, which states, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will you give him stone? And to, to conclude my talk on this poem, she also read a psalm where she said she reads a psalm for the man. Now, reading a psalm for someone often means you're hoping for bad things to befall your enemy. When someone says, I'm going to read a psalm for you, she's hoping for something bad to befall him because she's pleading inside for her son. And then at the end, she said, Absalom, which means amen. She's closing it off there. And this is a social issue because in our society today, and even before, young single mothers had the burden, just like the mother in this poem, of being both the mother and father to their children. And then when the boys especially grow up, they think that when they join the gangs and when they go out with someone that's part that the gang related, they feel as though, yeah, I found value, and they look up to that person, which is not something good. And with that, I'll close off my talk on social issues in society.
Thank you, Esther. That was very insightful. So as we're winding down, we have two more themes to go: historical issues and the theme of death. So in order to get into those themes, Esther, could you share some information on the theme of historical issues? I believe you have a poem and a poet that you would like to discuss, and then I'll take over after that, and you'll have the opportunity to share screen.
All right, no problem. So my poem it's entitled Sonnet Ballad by Gwendolyn Brooks. And Miss Gwendolyn is the first Black author, how lovely, to win the Pulitzer Prize in May 1st, 1950. And she was born on the 7th of June, 1917. She was a poet, a teacher, an author, first born to her parents. And by the 20th century, Miss Brooks had written more than 20 poetry books and won numerous awards, including the Poet Laureate of Illinois in 1968. And she held that title until December 3rd, 2000, when she died. Now, this poem is about a not a black woman, is about a woman whose beloved or whose love has left to join World War II. Now, we know from what history has told us that that the wars were a terrible time for families, especially those where their husbands or children went off to war. Nobody would want their son or their husband to go off to war because you don't know if this person would ever come back to you. You don't know what will happen. And she uses some devices in this poem, such as metaphor, comparison, irony, personification, and repetition. One line where she used repetition was where she said, would have to be untrue because she cannot believe that it's true that he's coming back. He said that he's coming back, but it doesn't feel as though it's true. And a metaphor that she uses is where she quoted where it is quoted, empty heart cup. And this is where she's comparing her heart to a cup that is empty of love. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Esther. It's interesting that we're on the topic of historical issues because I have a poem and a poet that dealt with historical issues. And the name of that poet is Wilfred Owen. Now, the interesting thing about Wilfred Owen is that he actually served during World War I. And when they were calling for soldiers to enlist for World War I, Wilfred Owen, he wanted to enlist for World War I. He was eager, as many young men back then, British young men, to be a part of the war. He actually grew up in England, near the Welsh border, and he wanted to be a poet. But when the call came for enlistment for the war, he enlisted in 1915, and he was stationed on the France border. But he soon realized that war wasn't anything fun because he was almost killed by a German sniper shortly afterward. And then a few months later, he fell into a 15-foot pit and he ended up with a concussion. Another set of months later, a grenade exploded near him, and that put him in hospital. And it's during his stay in the hospital that Wilfred Owen actually wrote a lot of poetic pieces that still endure to this day. So all of his poems were focused on World War I. So one poem that I found quite interesting from Wilfred Owen is the poem 1914. And what's interesting to note about the title 1914 is that that was the year that World War I began, 1914. Now, you may be wondering, what is 1914 about? Well, it's actually a sonnet written about the outbreak of World War I. And the poem, it laments the destructiveness of war. And it compares the rise and fall of various civilizations to the progress of the seasons, that is spring, summer, autumn, winter. So according to Wilfred Owen, World War I had thrust the world into a dark winter. And according to the speaker in the poem, it was unclear whether a new spring would follow. That is, if civilization could be renewed. And as you read through the poem, you get this sense because there are many devices that are actually used in that poem. For instance, there's the use of an extended metaphor throughout that poem. In the first line, he describes what is happening around, the speaker describes what is happening around him at that time to winter. He uses the statement, the winter of the world. Because of the darkness of the times, he compared it to winter because it's cold during that period of time and not much grows. He also uses further metaphors throughout the course of that poem. For instance, in line 3 of that poem, he uses the metaphor foul tornado centered at Berlin. He's implying there that the destructive winds that thrust the world into World War I began in Germany. And Germany was the hotbed of what the world was now thrust into. So throughout the course of that whole poem, he uses metaphors. I particularly like the metaphor in line 5 of that poem, where he compares progress to the sails of a ship. And in line 4, he mentions that this foul tornado would have damaged those sails of progress. In other words, all the accomplishments of human civilization were now being affected by this great war that they were experiencing. And nearing the close of that poem, it's interesting that Wilfred Owen, who is the author, his persona that he used in that poem, makes an interesting statement. right? In the final line of that poem, he uses the words blood for seed. And this is to emphasize the fact that because of the war and what it would have done to civilization, he's unsure whether there's a hope for renewal, because the only thing left to be sown, figuratively speaking, is the blood of the fallen men. So I found that poem to be very interesting, to highlight a prominent historical issue of World War I. So moving on from that, my final two poems are also by Wilfred Owen. And the titles of those two poems are Dulce et Decorum Est, which is a popular poem by Wilfred Owen, and Anthem for Doomed Youth. The reason why I chose those two poems, because the themes in both of them are similar. They both deal with death, and it vividly points out the destructive nature of war, which leads to death. Particularly in the first one, Dulce et Decorum Est. The poem's portrayal of the horror of war in that poem is total and complete. It reveals all aspects of war, living through it, dying in it, surviving it, and it shows that all aspects of war are brutal, agonizing, without meaning. There's a sense of disillusionment when you read the poem, right? It actually focuses on a gas attack, and it tells of a soldier who was too slow to put on his mask, and he ended up dying during that gas attack. But from the standpoint of the persona, he remembers that experience years afterward because of a type of shell shock that he would have experienced. And so through the words of the persona, he says, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. He refers to that as an old lie. Now, what does that statement mean? It actually means it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. So the persona refers to that as a lie. Now, why would he do so? Well, this is where our first device comes in, the device of irony. The title, It is Sweet and Fitting, contrasts with what we see as we read that poem. When we read that poem, all we see are images of death, suffering, and destruction. So there's nothing sweet and fitting about that. And so near the end of the poem, the persona says, it's a lie. It's a lie to believe that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. It's actually a painful, agonizing process. So I found that literary device of irony to be quite fitting. He also uses a lot of imagery in that poem to describe various things. For instance, he uses a lot of visual imagery. In line 1, there's the words bent double to describe the bent over posture of the soldiers because of exhaustion from the war. He uses the imagery bloodshot to describe their feet that was bloodied because of loss of boots during the course of the war. There's a lot of oral imagery with the words guttering to describe the effect of the blood coming out of the soldier's mouth because of poisoning from a gas attack. So the poem is very visceral in everything that it describes. This moves me to the final poem, which is entitled Anthem for Doomed Youth. And what's interesting about this poem is that this is also very ironic from the very beginning in the title. Now, Anthem for Doomed Youth, it's a poem that highlights the need to not romanticize war. Generally, when there's a war, individuals who are participants in that war, they tend to have a nationalistic fervor. It's important to die for your country, similar to the poem that I just mentioned. So you would find that politicians and others would try to stir up pro-war feelings in individuals. But the poet, Wilfred Owen, is urging us not to romanticize war. He sees war as something very futile, something horrific, something tragic. And through this poem, he brings to life the horrors of war. Now, the title Anthem for Doomed Youth is in itself ironic Because when we think about an anthem, we think about something positive, nationalistic, praise, a beautiful song. But in this title, it's juxtaposed against doomed youth. So it's not really an anthem in a positive sense, but in a very negative sense. So that's where the irony comes out in the poem. And throughout the course of the entire poem, we begin to understand why it's an anthem, because everything that's mentioned there, it's about death and destruction. I particularly like the personification used in the poem. In line 2, the artillery and the weaponry and the guns are referred to as having monstrous anger. And that to me is very well put to personify the effect that the guns would have on these soldiers, killing them like cattle. A few lines down, personification is used again in the line, shrill demented choirs of wailing shells. Now the wailing shells would represent the casings from the bullets, and the rattling of the guns as they go off is likened to a choir of singing people. So that's a very good device. It shows personification as well. And also in other lines in the poems, there's also rhetorical question being used, particularly at the beginning of stanza 1 and at the beginning of stanza 2, when the persona asks questions that he would go on to answer in other parts of the poem. But we're running out of time, so I'll close what I would have had to say at this point in time. I figured that we would have all gained a level of understanding, though brief, of these poems and what they have to offer. So does anyone have any closing remarks?
Other than very good job there, sir. Thank you for bringing over the concept of historical events and dead to us by using those two lovely poems.
Thank you. Well, as always, it was wonderful having you all here. I hope we can do this again next week. We can look at some fresh poems and some fresh themes. And as usual, I know that what you will bring will be very interesting. So I think at this point, we shall say our goodbyes. Goodbye, Shari. Goodbye, Raissa. Goodbye, Esther. It was nice having you.
Nice having
Goodbye,
you.
everyone.